Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Victory Road World Cup sponsored by Elgato. My name is Maeve Rourke. I am here with Gabby. We are going to be bringing a couple of really exciting games today. The first thing that we have, though, Panama and Russia has some really interesting qualifications, basically, just for one of these teams to move on to the next round.
Yeah, so for those of you who are unaware of how the team rounds works, this is going to come down to how teams do relative to other teams. The people who have more wins are going to be a little bit higher up in the rankings than the people who have losses. But for Panama and Russia right now, Panama needs to win 3 games out of the 8 games total they're going to be playing this week in order to move on to the next stage. Russia has to win 6 of those games. Russia is currently 3 wins, 0 losses against Panama. So we're in this very tricky situation where both of these teams need 3 wins in order to move on. But Panama certainly had a bit more breathing room, at least at the beginning of the week going into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Panama knows like they could go from a 3, they could only win 3 games and lose 5 and know that they're still safe. But the fact right now that they're 0-3 definitely, I think, has put them on the back foot a little bit. It's a very interesting, when we get to these three team groups in the World Cup, all the qualifiers are a little bit weird because it's not that standard 4 teams that we're looking at. But Panama has to still win bare minimum 3 games. Russia has to win 3 more. So, Panama's probably really looking for a win here just to get them started to this path so that they can move on to the elimination rounds.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and take a look at the matchup that we're going to be featuring today. As you can see here, a few matches have already been played for these teams. Some pretty standard teams so far, it looks like. I don't see anything too surprising, which is interesting to call out in contrast, to the games that we are going to see today. So Maeve, why don't you walk us through the 2 trainers who'll be facing off?
Yeah, so the 2 trainers we have are Alberto Ríos and Mark Yukelis. So Alberto's from Panama, Mark is from Russia. Alberto has this very fun team with Duskmane Necrozma, Incineroar, Lurantis, Porygon 2, Jellicent, and then of course that Grimmsnarl as well. So Duskmane Necrozma, one of the restricteds that you barely ever see run, and the Lurantis is a weird one as well. And then, of course, for Trick Room users, Jellicent has been put way on the back burner since maybe Series 1 of VGC 2020, so it's interesting to see it come out here.
Yeah, I would give Jellicent the benefit of the doubt and say maybe Series 2, maybe. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of those Pokemon that we haven't seen in forever. Does get access to Strength Sap as a form of recovery, and given the composition of Alberto's team, I wouldn't be surprised if the Porygon 2 and the Jellicent are those bulkier recovering variants. But, going into this game against his opponent, if we want to go ahead and swap everything over against Mark, the Palkia team isn't necessarily going to fall victim to this Trick Room strategy. I think Mark has some pretty strong Pokemon on his side of the field that are going to really make this matchup a struggle.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of bulky Pokemon on both sides, but Mark is running, like you said, that Palkia, the Incineroar, the Zapdos, the Landorus, Therian, Amoonguss, and the Stakataka. So like you said, some really hefty Trick Room on. Stakataka loves to be in Trick Room. Amoonguss can work in either way, still getting things like that Pollen Puff off or Rage Powder, able to boost HP on either side. Mark would have loved to probably face down something like a Kyogre with this Palkia, because that's a great matchup for him typically. So I think the Duskmane Necrozma might give him a little bit of trouble just because it's a little bit different. It's not always a team you prepare to play.
Yeah, but with the Landorus and the Incineroar, I think that does mean that Mark has a shot at this matchup. So I don't know about you, Maeve, but I'd love to take a look at these teams side by side in that team's preview screen. And already right off the bat, it looks like we have Alberto considering Trick Room, especially with a lead like Grimmsnarl and Porygon 2. And going for that Trick Room immediately, I think, is his best option against Mark. Yes, Mark has the Amoonguss and the Stakataka to sort of play around with the Twisted Dimensions, but especially when you're going into a game one scenario, I wouldn't be surprised if Mark will maybe save those Pokemon in the back of his party, or otherwise try and maybe just power through a Trick Room setup with the Landorus or maybe even that Palkia instead. So if you can catch your opponent off guard in game one, get that early Trick Room up, and then take a couple of knockouts while your opponent waits through the turns or otherwise pivots to reverse Trick Room, you can give yourself a pretty easy lead.
Yeah, and of course Mark has, Alberto has 3 different Trick Room Pokemon on his team, so he has some options to set it. But Mark here leads with the Palkia and the Landorus, so he'll have that Intimidate right off of the bat, and of course having that restricted out early, while Alberto sends out Porygon 2 and Grimmsnarl like we saw in team preview. So of course having having options for screen something really bulky, you gotta wonder, there's no fake out on the opponent's side of the field, so there's no way to stop Trick Room if they want it to go up.
Exactly, and that's exactly what Alberto was looking for going into this turn. The Intimidate is unfortunate, but on the other hand, neither of these Pokemon are physical attackers on Alberto's side of the field. So setting up a screen, I think that was the light screen, but I'm not 100% sure, followed by a Trick Room, and then maybe even a quick knockout or a switch next turn will give Alberto the momentum in this turn one.
Yeah, so there was that light screen there from the Grimmsnarl with a U-turn from the Landorus on Mark's side, so that is going to switch out maybe into something that might be more comfortable with this Trick Room, just depending on exactly what Mark's game plan was here. If he was hoping for a Trick Room to go up with a Pokemon like Stakataka in the back, who's very comfortable in that Trick Room setting, a much slower Pokemon. And then we also see here the Hydro Pump from the Palkia into the Grimmsnarl slot. This will still do a pretty decent chunk of damage, but not as much as it would have without that light screen, while the Trick Room comes up from the Porygon 2, switching the dimensions here.
So a perfect opportunity for that Staka to come in onto the field, since Grimmsnarl nor Porygon 2 are going to be able to deal enough damage to knock it out. It's possible something like a Taunt could stop the reverse of the Trick Room, but overall Alberto is forced to pivot this turn, and I think Mark can definitely take advantage of that. Even if the Stakataka stays in and goes for Trick Room, foregoing something like a Rock Slide or a Gyro Ball for damage, Palkia is pretty free given Alberto's need to switch to go for an attack this turn as well. So you could do a Spatial Rend into that Porygon 2 slot, possibly try and catch something on a switch. You go for a Hydro Pump into the Grimmsnarl. It's really Mark's choice here as to which Pokemon he wants to target first.
Yeah, Grimmsnarl switches out for the Lurantis on Alberto's side, though, and then we have a Gyro Ball into the Lurantis slot, which does well over half damage, and then we see the Tri-Attack here from the Porygon 2 into the Palkia slot, and this does just a little bit, probably just about a third, while we then see the Spatial Rend here from the Palkia into that Porygon 2, and that just does just about a quarter or a third of that HP as well. Porygon 2, so bulky, such a problem to deal with.
It's definitely a problem to deal with, but getting the damage down onto that Lurantis was the priority for Mark in this turn. Seeing that Porygon 2 has Tri-Attack and possibly not something like Ice Beam, admittedly we've only seen a couple of its attacks so far, does mean that Mark has a win condition where he can simply out-damage Porygon by having more Pokemon on the field.
Lurantis switches out, though, brings in that Necrozma Duskmane, and then we see another Gyro Ball here from the Stakataka into the Porygon 2, bringing it down to under half of its health, but it gets that recover off, and that's going to bring this Porygon 2 almost all the way back up to full health here. Very, very close. And then the Palkia here will go for another Spatial Rend, and if this goes into the Porygon, it does not. Goes into that Necrozma Duskmane, does just a small amount of damage, was probably hoping to get that knockout on the Lurantis.
Oh, definitely. Also, an interesting switch here with the Necrozma in for the Lurantis. Yes, Lurantis was possibly going to be knocked out, but you would have thought that the Necrozma would have appeared first, given the Pokemon on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. The Gyro Ball again into the Porygon, not doing a ton of damage. That Tri-Attack from the Porygon into the Palkia does a really decent chunk, and then we also have here that Photon Geyser from the from the Necrozma into the Palkia, getting that knockout there. And that is a really big knockout in this Trick Room setting for Alberto, getting rid of the Palkia that can do consistent damage. And then Mark brings in that Landorus, getting Intimidate off onto two Pokemon that are, onto this Porygon that's not really going to mind it all that much. And of course, without that clear body that the Solgaleo typically has, it is going to deal with that Intimidate.
Yes, the Necrozma is going to be forced to switch out this turn, I think, after the Landorus reveal. If Alberto keeps it in, I think it's just an acknowledgement that he would be able to find a knockout here on the Landorus or the Stakataka, even with that Intimidate. I really, really liked that turn there, focusing on the Palkia, because it is the bigger threat for Alberto's team, especially now that we know all three of Mark's remaining Pokemon.
Yeah, Zapdos comes out for the Landorus that just came in with another Gyro Ball from the Stakataka into the Porygon 2 slot, which then goes for a Tri-Attack into the Zapdos here, so it does a really good chunk of damage, just under half, and then a Photon Geyser again from this Necrozma, and that goes into the Zapdos slot as well. It is not enough to knock it out, brings it just into the bottom quarter of its health, and now Trick Room is finally gone.
So an interesting thing to note about these past few turns of Trick Room is that Mark essentially let the Trick Room play out. He didn't make any attempts to reverse it, and I think he incorrectly made the assumption that the Porygon 2 wouldn't have been able to take down this Palkia. And yes, Mark got some really good damage down onto the field during those Trick Room turns, but Alberto has just remained on top. So I think Mark has to be very careful and ensure Alberto can't get Trick Room up again if he wants to get that momentum back on his side.
Yeah, and of course the Porygon goes for that recover here, gets a bunch of that HP back after losing so much earlier. Another Gyro Ball from the Stakataka into this Porygon 2 slot, and then we see another Trick Room here from the Duskmane Necrozma, which again, he has three Trick Room users on his team with that Porygon, with possibly that Jellicent, and with this Necrozma Duskmane, so not going to want to stay out of Trick Room for too long.
No, and again, no attempt from Mark to reverse it.
Yeah, the Gyro Ball from the Stakataka into the Porygon here. Another Tri-Attack into the Zapdos. So a lot of the same moves we're seeing over and over again. And then we see another Photon Geyser. This should be enough to knock that Zapdos out, and now that Tri-Attack did so much damage. And these Pokemon trainers are picking their moves so quickly, Gabby. You are not getting enough analysis in.
I know, but on the other hand, I'm sitting here wondering to myself, what is the key thing that we can take away at this point in time? Because we keep seeing these same moves. We see the Gyro Balls, we see the Tri-Attack, we see the Photon Geyser. And you have to wonder, why is this Stakataka consistently going for Gyro Ball when you have to assume it knows Trick Room as well, and it could reverse the dimensions, and it could give the Landorus or the Zapdos the opportunity to attack. I think Mark just underestimated the power and the consistency of both the Porygon 2, the Lurantis, the Necrozma under Trick Room, and that's why he didn't make an attempt to really reverse it. He thought, Gyro Ball is such a powerful attack on Stakataka. It's already at such a low speed. It's doing decent damage to these Pokemon on the opposing side of the field that are supposed to like Trick Room. I'm fine, but I think that at the end of the day, you just can't necessarily out damage two Pokemon when you are only one Pokemon, barring something like an explosion with Gen 3 mechanics or whatever. So going into this game too, what I want to see from Mark is an acknowledgement of how much trouble Trick Room was indeed for him, despite the fact he brought Stakataka, and work to either reverse the Trick Room and rely on his other Pokemon who didn't really attack other than Palkia that entire game. Or maybe just bring a Moongus and say, okay, I can't out damage Trick Room, maybe I can just out slow play it.
Yeah, and something I would have loved to see too is maybe something like a fake out from that Incineroar. Incineroar wasn't brought at all. Mark only really brought Pokemon that do damage that game, and it really didn't pay off because he had no utility for what he needed to do. There wasn't even anything like a Rock Slide to try and get a flinch on any sort of Pokemon that could have used Trick Room that turn. It's just didn't really try and fight against the Trick Room, when I think that just the ability for Alberto to get that consistent damage off onto the Pokemon on Mark's side, was able to whittle him down enough where Zapdos Roost wasn't healing enough for the damage it was taking. And then of course Alberto's Porygon was just consistently recovering because he was not getting enough damage to offset the amount he was gaining from each recovery.
Yeah, and again, I really have to wonder if you're in Mark's shoes. Like, honestly, what was going through my mind that entire game was like, does Stakataka even know Trick Room? Like, that is another thing we could discuss. It's a weird thing to bring up because when you think of Stakataka, you think of it as the Trick Room user on a team, regardless if the team itself is really suited for Trick Room. But looking at this lead, I think that we're already seeing an adjustment and possibly an indication that there will be no Stakataka today.
Yeah, Amoonguss instead there on Mark's side with the Palkia, and then the same lead from Alberto with that Porygon 2 and that Grimmsnarl here. So there could possibly be another set of screens going up. That Porygon actually switches out though, so no Trick Room from the Porygon on this side today. Brings in that Duskmane Necrozma. Again, we saw how much damage it was doing. Another Hydro Pump, but the evasion there for the Grimmsnarl, and then the Grimmsnarl here goes for that one damaging move that I cannot remember the translation from Spanish, so I do apologize. Does lower the stats there for Palkia as well, and then a Spore does not get the effect here against the Pokemon, the Duskmane Necrozma here.
Yeah, so switching in the safety goggles there to put some further pressure down onto the field, and also the Spirit Break from the Grimmsnarl dealing such a good amount of damage to Palkia. With all these powerful dragon restricted type Pokemon in the format, Grimmsnarl has become even more valuable than just the screen user.
All right, thank you for Spirit Break. And then we get the Rage Powder here. After that, Lurantis switches in for the Grimmsnarl. A Hydro Pump does connect, though, onto the Duskmane Necrozma, does just under half, and then a Trick Room here from the Duskmane Necrozma, so still able to get that Trick Room up. Switching the dimensions, going to be putting the Pokemon on Alberto's side faster.
And I really like this pivot again from Alberto. He's just making sure that this Amoonguss is not going to be able to do anything right now while keeping the pressure down onto the Palkia. And sort of the same strategy we saw in that game one. You focus on the attacking Pokemon and then you worry about the Amoonguss later on.
Yeah, we did see a Pollen Puff there from the Amoonguss into the Duskmane. Necrozma does a little bit of damage here. And then a Superpower from the Lurantis into that Palkia does bring it down almost to knockout range, while the Photon Geyser from the Necrozma Duskmane is enough to finish this Palkia off. So this Amoonguss was able to get the Necrozma into that knockout range from one of those moves from the Palkia there, but it wasn't able to capitalize, while Stakataka switches in for the Palkia slot.
So interesting. Mark really did pivot hard into Trick Room going into this game too, with both the Stakataka and Amoonguss, but Alberto almost making the read at team preview that maybe you don't use Trick Room this turn. The Stakataka is really suited to do a lot of damage here, or possibly even get own Trick Room up on its own, but the superpower from the Lurantis with the boost already is going to do so much damage.
Yeah, a Gyro Ball and a Pollen Puff both go into the Lurantis slot. Doesn't get it down to even a quarter of its health, but another superpower into the Stakataka. That contrary ability that Lurantis carries is so good with a move like Superpower, just consistently boosting its stats instead of dropping them here. So that Lurantis, every time it gets a knockout, it's almost like getting something like a Beast boost or something like a Grim Neigh boost here with all those boosts that it's getting. And then the Landorus switches in for the Stakataka here. This is for the fainted Stakataka. Apologies. That Intimidate into the Lurantis with that contrary ability really just means that that attack stat's going to go straight up into the sky.
Yeah, unfortunately for Lurantis, it is going to be slower than both the Amoonguss and the Landorus, which is something for Alberto to note if we get a Game 3. But I think given that Landorus, again, is really the only Pokemon who's in a position where it can deal enough damage to pick up a knockout, Lurantis should get the opportunity to attack.
Lurantis actually does, and it is enough to knock out the Landorus on the opponent's side there, even after taking that little bit of Pollen Puff damage from the Amoonguss here. The Photon Geyser, once again from Necrozma, goes into that Amoonguss slot, does so much damage, almost enough to knock it out, brings it down to the bottom 25%. So even if there was something like, even if there is some sort of regenerator recovery, you know, this Amoonguss is not going to be able to take another one of those.
Yeah, and I think that we actually missed a Trick Room somewhere up in there, because Amoonguss went first with Pollen Puff for a couple of turns, and that's not supposed to happen normally. So really well played for Peru finally taking, or excuse me, for Panama finally taking that first win. Alberto setting his team up so they only need 2 more to move on to the next round here in the World Cup.
Yeah, I think Ben and JJ are a little mad at how quick those 2 games were for us after that very long match that they had in the very beginning of the tournament. But, you know, it's still a great match. I love seeing interesting restricteds. You know, we have, you know, for the past several years, we've seen a lot of Kyogre, a lot of Groudon, a lot of Xerneas, and now we're seeing especially a lot of Zacian and Calyrex here. So seeing that Duskmane Necrozma and knowing that this player has 3 different options, I mean, we don't exactly know that Jellicent could not be running Trick Room, but to me it feels pretty safe of a call to assume that it is. But having 3 Trick Room users on that team and then being able to capitalize on it so well, even when you have slower Pokemon on the opponent's team like that Amoonguss, like that Stakataka, I think that's absolutely huge. Especially, you know, that Lurantis, when it starts getting those boosts up from those superpowers, it just really steamrolls the opponent's team.
It really does. And I think the rise in popularity of Pokemon like Lurantis, Milotic, Galarian Zapdos with those abilities that punish stat drops is really in response to the popularity of Pokemon like Incineroar. I find it curious that they're rising in popularity now, given that you would assume that in a Dynamax format there would be more opportunities for stat drops or other shenanigans to happen on the field. But I think it just goes to show you how consistent Incineroar is in this format, that the opportunity has finally arrived for these Pokemon to make a return. So I'm hoping we'll see some other interesting teams as we move on in the other games, both today and tomorrow, to sort of wrap up this week of the World Cup qualifiers. But for now, that was a really fun match to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. That was super, super fun. We will be right back, Gabby and I will, for the very next match. So we're going to take a quick break, get all that set up, and then we will be back to watch the very next match today.